All right, well, it's time for Chapter 6 in A Bear Called Paddington by Michael Bond. We're here at the Caribou Public Library, and I am Miss Erin, here for our chapter book story time. Thank you for joining us, and I'm so glad that you're here. I hope you guys are enjoying A Bear Called Paddington so far. I know I am. Such a cute bear who just doesn't know when he's about to cause some trouble, does he? All right, let's see what happens in Chapter 6 today. It's called A Visit to the Theater. Sounds fun. Here he is with his binoculars. The Browns were all very excited. Mr. Brown had been given tickets for a box at the theater. It was the first night of a brand new play, and the leading part was being played by the world-famous actor, Sir Seeley Bloom. Even Paddington became infected with the excitement. He made several journeys to his friend, Mr. Gruber, to have the theater explained to him. Mr. Gruber thought he was very lucky to be going to the first night of a new play. "All sorts of famous people will be there," he said. "I don't suppose many bears have that sort of opportunity once in a lifetime." Mr. Gruber lent Paddington several second-hand books about the theater. He was rather a slow reader, but there were lots of pictures, and in one of them, a big cutout model of a stage, which sprang up every time he opened the pages. Paddington decided that when he grew up, he wanted to be an actor. He took to standing on his dressing table and striking poses in the mirror, just as he had seen them in the books. Mrs. Brown had her own thoughts on the subject. "I do hope it's a nice play," she said to Mrs. Bird. "You know what Paddington's like. He does take these things so seriously." "Oh, well," said Mrs. Bird, "I shall sit at home and listen to the wireless in peace and quiet. But it'll be an experience for him, and he does like experiences so. Besides, he's been very good lately." "I know," said Mrs. Brown. "That's what worries me." As it turns out, the play itself was the least of Mrs. Brown's worries. Paddington was unusually silent all the way to the theater. It was the first time he had been out after dark, and the very first time he had seen the lights of London. Mr. Brown pointed out all the famous landmarks as they drove past in the car, and it was a gay party of Browns that eventually trooped into the theater. Paddington was pleased to find it all exactly as Mr. Gruber had described it to him, even down to the commissionaire, who opened the door for them and saluted as they entered the foyer. Paddington returned the salute with a wave of his paw, and then sniffed. Everything was painted red and gold, and the theater had a nice, warm, friendly sort of smell. There was a slight upset in the cloakroom when he found he had to pay in order to leave his duffel coat and suitcase. The woman behind the counter turned quite nasty when Paddington asked for his things back. She was still talking about it in a loud voice as the attendant led them along the passage toward their seats. At the entrance to the box, the attendant paused. "Program, sir?" she said to Paddington. "Yes, please," said Paddington, taking 5. "Thank you very much." "And would you like coffee in the interval, sir?" she asked. Paddington's eyes glistened. "Oh, yes, please," he said, imagining that it was a kind thought on the part of the theater. He tried to push his way past, but the attendant barred the way. "That'll be £7.50, she said, £1 for each of the programs, and 50 pence for the coffee. Paddington looked as if he could hardly believe his ears. £7.50, he repeated. £7.50? "That's all right, Paddington," said Mr. Brown, anxious to avoid another fuss. "It's my treat. You go in and sit down." Paddington obeyed like a shot, but he gave the attendant some very queer looks while she arranged some cushions for his seat in the front row. All the same, he was pleased to see that she had given him the one nearest the stage. He'd already sent a postcard to his Aunt Lucy with a carefully drawn copy of a plan of the theater, which he found in one of Mr. Gruber's books, and a small cross in one corner marked "My Seat." The theater was quite full, and Paddington waved to the people down below. Much to Mrs. Brown's embarrassment, several of them pointed and waved back. "I do wish he wouldn't be quite so friendly," she whispered to Mr. Brown. "Wouldn't you like to take off your duffel coat now?" asked Mr. Brown. "It'll be cold when you go out again." Paddington climbed up and stood on his chair. I think perhaps I will, he said. It is getting warm. Judy started to help him off with it. Mind my marmalade sandwich, cried Paddington, as she placed it on the ledge in front of him. But it was too late. He looked round guiltily. Oh, crikey, said Jonathan. It's fallen on someone's head. He looked over the edge of the box. It's that man with the bald head. He looks jolly cross. Oh, Paddington, Mrs. Brown looked despairingly at him. Do you have to bring marmalade sandwiches to the theatre? It's all right, said Paddington cheerfully. I've some more in the other pocket if anyone wants one. They're a bit squashed, I'm afraid, because I sat on them in the car. There seems to be some sort of a row going on down below, said Mr. Brown, craning his head to look over the edge. Some chap just waved his fist at me. What's all this about marmalade sandwiches? Mr. Brown was a bit slow on the uptake sometimes. Nothing, dear, said Mrs. Brown hastily. She decided to let the matter drop. It was much easier in the long run. In any case, Paddington was having a great struggle with himself over some opera glasses. He had just seen a little box in front of him marked opera glasses, 20 pence. Eventually, after a great deal of thought, he unlocked his suitcase and from a secret compartment withdrew 20 pence. I don't think much of these, he said a moment later, looking through them at the audience. Everyone looks smaller. You've got them the wrong way around, silly, said Jonathan. Well, I still don't think much of them, said Paddington, turning them around. I wouldn't have bought them if I'd known. Still, he added after a moment's thought, they might come in useful next time. Just as he began to speak, the overture came to an end and the curtain rose. The scene was the living room of a large house, and Sir Seeley Bloom, in the part of the village squire, was pacing up and down. There was a round of applause from the audience. You don't take them home, whispered Judy. You have to put them back when you leave. What? Cried Paddington in a loud voice. Several calls of hush came from the darkened theatre as Sir Seeley Bloom paused and looked pointedly in the direction of the Browns' box. Do you mean to say— Words failed Paddington for the moment. 20 pence, he said bitterly. That's 2 buns' worth. He turned his gaze on Sir Seeley Bloom. Sir Seeley Bloom looked rather irritable. He didn't like first nights, and this one in particular had started badly. He had a nasty feeling about it. He much preferred playing a hero, where he had the sympathy of the audience, and in this play he was the villain. Being the first night of the play, he wasn't at all sure of some of his lines. To make matters worse, he had arrived at the theatre only to discover that the prompt boy was missing, and there was no one else to take his place. Then there was the disturbance in the stalls just before the curtain went up, something to do with the marmalade sandwich, so the stage manager had said. Of course, that was all nonsense, but still it was very disturbing. And then there was this noisy crowd in the box. He sighed to himself. It was obviously going to be one of those nights. But if Sir Seeley Bloom's heart was not in the play, Paddington's certainly was. He soon forgot about his wasted 20 pence and devoted all his attention to the plot. He decided quite early on that he didn't like Sir Seeley Bloom, and he stared at him hard through his opera glasses. He followed his every move, and when, at the end of the first act, Sir Seeley, in the part of the hard-hearted father, turned his daughter out into the world without a penny, Paddington stood up on his chair and waved his program indignantly at the stage. Paddington was a surprising bear in many ways, and he had a strong sense of right and wrong. As the curtain came down, he placed his opera glasses firmly on the ledge and climbed off his seat. Are you enjoying it, Paddington? Asked Mr. Brown. It's very interesting, said Paddington. He had a determined note to his voice, and Mrs. Brown looked at him sharply. She was beginning to recognize that tone, and it worried her. Where are you going, dear? She asked, as he made for the door of the box. Oh, just for a walk, said Paddington vaguely. Well, don't be long, she called, as the door closed behind him. You don't want to miss any of the second act. Oh, don't fuss, Mary, said Mr. Brown. I expect he just wants to stretch his legs or something. He's probably gone out to the cloakroom. But at that moment, Paddington was going not in the direction of the cloakroom, but towards a door leading to the back of the theatre. It was marked Private, Artists Only. As he pushed the door open and passed through, he immediately found himself in an entirely different world. There were no red plush seats. Everything was very bare. Lots of ropes hung down from the roof. Pieces of scenery were stacked against the walls, and everyone seemed in a great hurry. Normally, Paddington would have been most interested in everything, but now he had a purposeful look on his face. What do you think he's going to do? Seeing a man bending over some scenery, he walked over and tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me," he said, "can you tell me where the man is?" The scene hand went on working. "Man," he said. "What man?" "The man," said Paddington impatiently. "The nasty man." "Oh, you mean Mr. Sir Seeley." The scene hand pointed toward the long corridor. "He's in his dressing room. You'd better not go disturbing him, 'cause he's not in a very good mood." He looked up. "Hey," he cried. "You're not supposed to be in here. Who let you in?" Paddington was too far away to answer, even if he had heard. He was already halfway up the corridor, looking closely at all the doors. Eventually he came to one with a large star on it with the words Sir Seeley Bloom in big gold letters. Paddington drew a deep breath and then knocked loudly. There was no reply, so he knocked again. Still there was no reply, so, very cautiously, he pushed open the door with his paw. "Go away," said a booming voice. "I don't want to see anyone." Paddington peered around the door. Sir Seeley Bloom was lying, stretched out on a long couch. He looked tired and cross. He opened one eye and gazed at Paddington. "I'm not signing any autographs," he growled. "I don't want your autograph," said Paddington, fixing him with a hard stare. "I wouldn't want your autograph if I had my autograph book, and I haven't got my autograph book, so there." Sir Seeley sat up. "You don't want my autograph?" he said in a surprised voice. "But everyone wants my autograph." "Well, I don't," said Paddington. "I've come to tell you to take your daughter back." He gulped the last few words. The great man seemed to have grown to about twice the size that he had been on stage, and he looked as if he was going to explode at any minute. Sir Seeley clutched his forehead. "You want me to take my daughter back?" he said at last. "That's right," said Paddington firmly, "and if you don't, I expect she can come and stay with Mr. and Mrs. Brown." Sir Seeley Bloom ran his hand distractedly through his hair, and then pinched himself. "Mr. and Mrs. Brown," he repeated in a dazed voice. He looked wildly round the room, and then dashed to the door. "Sarah!" he called in a loud voice. "Sarah, come in here at once!" He backed around the room until he had placed the couch between himself and Paddington. "Keep away, Bear," he said dramatically, and then peered at Paddington, for he was rather short-sighted. "You are a bear, aren't you?" he added. "That's right," said Paddington, "from darkest Peru." Sir Seeley looked at his woolen hat. "Well, then," he said crossly, playing for time, "you ought to know better than to wear a green hat in my dressing room. Don't you know green is a very unlucky color in the theater? Take it off at once." "It's not my fault," said Paddington. "I wanted to wear my proper hat." He had just started to explain all about his hat when the door burst open and the lady called Sarah entered. Paddington immediately recognized her as Sir Seeley's daughter in the play. "It's all right," he said. "I've come to rescue you." "You've what?" The lady seemed most surprised. "Sarah," Sir Seeley Bloom came from behind the couch. "Sarah, protect me from this mad bear." "I'm not mad," said Paddington indignantly. "Then kindly explain what you are doing in my dressing room," boomed the great actor. Paddington sighed. Sometimes people were very slow to understand things. Patiently, he explained it all to them. When he had finished, the lady called Sarah threw back her head and laughed. "I'm glad you think it's funny," said Sir Seeley. "But, darling, don't you see?" she said. "It's a great compliment. Paddington really believes you were throwing me out into the world without a penny. It shows what a great actor you are." Sir Seeley thought for a moment. "Humph," he said gruffly. "Quite an understandable mistake, I suppose. He looks a remarkably intelligent bear, come to think of it." Paddington looked from one to the other. "Then you were only acting all the time," he faltered. The lady bent down and took his paw. "Of course, darling, but it was very kind of you to come to my rescue. I shall always remember it." "Well, I would have rescued you if you'd wanted it," said Paddington. Sir Seeley coughed. "Are you interested in the theater, Bear?" he boomed. "Oh, yes," said Paddington, "very much. Except I don't like having to pay so much for everything. I want to be an actor when I grow up." The lady called Sarah jumped up. "Why, Seeley, darling," she said, looking at Paddington, "I've an idea. she whispered in Sir Seeley's ear, and then Sir Seeley looked at Paddington. "It's a bit unusual," he said thoughtfully, "but it's worth a try. Yes, it's certainly worth a try." In the theater itself, the interval was almost at an end, and the Browns were getting restless. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown, "I wonder where he's got to." "If he doesn't hurry up," said Mr. Brown, "he's going to miss the start of the second act." Just then there was a knock at the door, and an attendant handed him a note. "A young bear gentleman asked me to give you this," he announced. "He said it was very urgent." "Thank you," said Mr. Brown, taking the note and opening it. "What does it say?" asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Is he all right?" Mr. Brown handed her the note to read. "Your guess is as good as mine," he said. Mrs. Brown looked at it. It was hastily written in pencil, and it said, "I have been given a very important job. Paddington. P.S. I will tell you about it later." "Now what on earth can that mean?" she said. "Trust something unusual to happen to Paddington." "I don't know," said Mr. Brown, settling back in his chair as the lights went down. "But I'm not going to let it spoil the play." "I hope the second half is better than the first," said Jonathan. "I thought the first half was rotten. That man kept on forgetting his lines." The second half was much better than the first. From the moment Sir Seeley strode onto the stage, the theater was electrified. A great change had come over him. He no longer fumbled over his lines, and people who had coughed all through the first half now sat up in their seats and hung on his every word. When the curtain finally came down on the end of the play, with Sir Seeley's daughter returning to his arms, there was a great burst of applause. The curtain rose again, and the whole company bowed to the audience. Then it rose while Sir Seeley and Sarah bowed. But still the cheering went on. Finally, Sir Seeley stepped forward and raised his hand for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "thank you for your kind applause. We are indeed most grateful. But before you leave, I would like to introduce the youngest and most important member of our company, a young, bear who came to our rescue." The rest of Sir Seeley's speech was drowned in a buzz of excitement as he stepped forward to the very front of the stage, where a small screen hid a hole in the boards which was the prompt box. He took hold of one of Paddington's paws and pulled. Paddington's head appeared through the hole. In his other paw he was grasping a copy of the script. "Come along, Paddington," said Sir Seeley. "Come and take your bow." "I can't," gasped Paddington. "I think I'm stuck." And stuck he was. It took several stage hands, a fireman, and a lot of butter to remove him after the audience had gone. But he was far enough out to twist round and raise his hat to a cheering crowd before the curtain came down for the last time. Several nights later, anyone going into Paddington's room would have found him sitting up in bed with his scrapbook, a pair of scissors, and a pot of paste. He was busy pasting in a picture of Sir Seeley Bloom, which the great man had signed, "To Paddington, with grateful thanks." There was also a signed picture from the lady called Sarah, and one of his proudest possessions, a newspaper cutting about the play, headed, "Paddington Saves the Day." Mr. Gruber had told him that the photographs were probably worth a bit of money, but after much thought, he decided not to part with them. In any case, Sir Seeley Bloom had given him his 20 pence back, and a pair of opera glasses. And here he is, sleeping soundly, after all the excitement. All right, well, I hope you guys have a great rest of your evening. Thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.